This is a review of the first 2 pages of your review packet. So, for number 1, is a temperature of -8 degrees warmer or colder than a temperature of -12 degrees? And explain your answer in complete sentences. So, one of the number 1 ways that we talk about negative numbers is in terms of temperature. So right here you can see a thermometer. And on the thermometer, we have 0, which is the freezing point, the temperature in which water will turn to ice or begin to freeze. And up above, we can see that as we go up, temperatures get warmer in positive temperatures, right? So the hottest temperature shown is 8 degrees. And as we go below freezing point and we start counting negatives, it's getting colder. So the coldest degree shown on this particular thermometer is -8 degrees. And so, as we go down, as we begin to count away with negatives, it gets colder. So in this case, -12 degrees is colder than -8. Because the quote-unquote larger the negative, the smaller or colder it is. And once again, the reason why I have larger in quotations is because -12 looks larger, right? 12, we think of 12 as being larger than 8, but in the case of negative numbers, -12 is actually smaller than -8, so therefore it is colder. It is. Now, for number 2, is an elevation of -6 feet closer or farther from the surface of the ocean than an elevation of -1 feet? So once again, another context where we talk about negative numbers is elevation, and that is how high or low something is on the planet. So you can see that 0 is sea level. So the majority of the planet is ocean, so we use that as our basis to compare heights. So anywhere in the ocean, if you are at the surface, you are at sea level, your elevation is 0. If you start to go up in the air, or if you were to climb a hill, your elevation would begin to count up. And if you decided to swim below the surface, you would start going into the negatives. So the shark is 5 meters below the surface, and then the octopus is even deeper at -10 meters below the surface. So now which one is closer, -1 or -6? Well, -1 would be right here, just 1 foot below the surface, and -6 would be down here. So -1 is closer to the surface. Is closer to the surface. Because it is only 1 foot from sea level. It's only 1 foot down, whereas -6 is 6 feet down. It was 8 degrees at nightfall, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees by midnight. So what was the temperature at midnight? Draw a number line to help you explain your answer. So once again, we can see it's starting at 8 degrees. And then it counts down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now I'm at freezing point, but I have to keep going 2 more. 9, 10. So if I started at 8 degrees and dropped 10 degrees, I would now be at -2 degrees. It would be -2 degrees Celsius. Because 8 minus 10 equals -2. So remember, if you're ever doing subtraction and the number in front is smaller than the number doing the subtracting, then you're going to wind up into the negatives. Now a diver is 25 feet below sea level and he swims up 15 feet towards the surface. What is his elevation? So his elevation starts at -25 because he's below sea level, and then he swims up. So he's coming closer to the surface. And so -25 up is positive, plus 15 is -10. So he would be 10 feet below the surface still. and that is an elevation of negative 10 feet. If you're below the surface of the ocean, then your elevation is negative. Now read the following situations about the whale and its elevation, and answer each in complete sentences. A whale is at the surface of the ocean to breathe. What is the whale's current elevation at sea level? Its elevation is 0 feet. Because it's at sea level. Once again, when we think about elevation, 0 is sea level, which is the surface of the ocean. So he's right here, his elevation is 0. And then the whale swims down 100 feet. So if you start at 0 and you subtract 100, you go down 100. His new elevation would be negative 100 feet. And now, for the final one, the whale swims down 150 more feet. So what is the whale's elevation now? Well, if you started at 100 feet below, an elevation of negative 100, and then you subtracted another negative 150, the whale would now be 250 feet below the surface. He's just going deeper and deeper. All right, now for the second page in this review. It says comparing numbers with absolute value. So we're going to be using inequalities greater than, less than, or equal to compare these numbers. And really important, it says before comparing any numbers, make sure you convert any number in absolute value notation into what it actually equals. So the absolute value notation looks like this, with the 2 bars on either end. And so, number 1, no absolute value. We've got negative 20 and 12. 12 is greater because positives are always greater than negatives. Now for number 2, we have 2 different absolute values. So we have the absolute value of negative 11 and the absolute value of 5. So remember, anytime you see that absolute value notation, what that is asking you is what is the number inside's distance from 0. So you're not just taking that number's value, you're taking that number's distance from 0. And so negative 11 is 11 units to the left, and 5 is 5 units to the right. It's really important to note, a common misconception that a lot of people keep making is they think that absolute value just means opposite. It does not mean opposite. It means a number's distance from 0. And we always measure distance from 0 in positive terms. So negatives will become positive, positives will stay positive. And now that we have solved this, we can clearly see that 11 is greater than 5. So the absolute value of negative 11 is greater than the absolute value of 5. Next one, 6 and negative 6. Once again, positives are always greater than negatives. Now we have the absolute value of 6. So the 6's distance from 0 is 6. 6 to the right. The absolute value of negative 6 is also 6. It's 6 units to the left. And so this one would actually be equal. The absolute value of 6 and negative 6 is the same. 1/2 and negative 1. 1/2 is greater. Once again, it's positive. No matter how small the positive, always greater than negatives. 9 and the absolute value of negative 11. Well, the absolute value of negative 11 is actually just positive 11, and 11 is greater than 9. Absolute value of negative 9 is 9. Absolute value of negative 23 is 23. So the absolute value of negative 23 is greater than the absolute value of negative 9. And now the absolute value of negative 9 and negative 23 is normal, and the absolute value of negative 9 is actually greater, because once again, this one we had to turn into positive because it was asking for the absolute value. And then finally, define absolute value and why the absolute value of negative 8 has greater value than 7. Absolute value is a number's distance from 0. and is always positive. Therefore, the absolute value of negative 8 is actually just 8, and 8 is greater than 7. Okay, so make sure you correct this work, and then go on and complete the next 2 pages.